for an overview on space programs going on now really all over the world, we're joined by Keith Cowing. He's a former rocket scientist and editor of NASAWatch.com and an astrobiologist. Always a pleasure to talk with you, Keith. I always look forward to these chats. I want to begin by talking about Japan, and let's hope they can reconnect and get the battery power up and running and see what it can do. But really, an amazing landing. They were able to put that craft down within about the length of a soccer pitch of exactly where they tried to land. Explain the importance of that and why Japan really was pushing for that.
Well, even if the mission does nothing else, the fact that they were able to pick a specific part of the moon, not flat with no features, it had boulders and was at an angle like this. The idea is that as we, many different nations, plan to go back to the moon and do things there, we want to land in places that are maybe harder to get, but we want to know exactly where we're going. And so this spacecraft, if you listen to the play-by-play, they talked about, the spacecraft would come in, it would stop, and it would look around, and it would look at the features around it and say, okay, I'm here. It would go lower, look for boulders,
wow.
And then it would find it. So this is really what, if we're going to be sending a lot of spacecraft to the moon, ideally, you'd want them to be able to do this. Now, something happened after it landed, which is problematical, but the goal of this mission was really to do what it did.
It's a lot of high fives in the Japanese mission control room. Let's talk a bit about the United States, because a couple of, there's no other way to term it, big setbacks. Certainly having to steer this latest mission back into the atmosphere to burn up, but also a former NASA director speaking very frankly on Capitol Hill saying, look, the U.S. effort to go to the moon is a debacle right now, and there's a good chance China is going to beat the U.S. back to the moon, and he had very harsh words for trying to mix government money with private money and make this happen the way that everybody thought it was going to be the most efficient way forward.
Mike Griffin complains too much. Pretty much the system that NASA is following now is what he came up with, and he came up with it against the advice of a lot of people, and then the funding didn't show up. And, I don't know what to say to Mike Griffin. I haven't really put an editorial up yet about this, but, he's always complaining about things, but whenever he offers a solution, it's a non-starter. And as far as, China beating the U.S. back to the moon, newsflash, we won 50 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
mean, okay. And by the way, a lot of other countries want to go back there too, and a lot of companies. So I don't know, for there to be a race back to the moon, everybody has to perceive that they are in a race, and you can't have it one-sided. And China has just determined to go back, and they're being very methodical and very successful at it.
Right.
But I think this is a lot of personal anxieties over things that could have been that are not.
Interesting. Keith, also, the U.S. has also looked beyond the moon. Where is the effort for long space flight to go to perhaps Mars?
Well, the plan that we've sort of followed, and it's not just us, it's Europe, everybody, is to sort of learn how to do things in Earth orbit with space stations. And now, as I joked with somebody the other day, I was watching video, and there was a spacewalk, and I was watching the astronauts, and I thought, since I helped build the space station, one of thousands of people who did, I kind of know my way around.
Yeah.
And I couldn't figure out, well, the reason I was confused is it wasn't International Space Station, it was the other space station, China's. So we're now in a position where it's not just this and nothing else, it's many of them. And these things are all sort of overlapping, and even though politics may stop it, the whole idea is to do the Earth orbit thing, go to the moon, figure out how to do things longer term in the moon. In other words, do your homework on the moon before you go to Mars.
Right.
And then go to Mars or elsewhere. So that's sort of the grand scheme, and everybody still seems to be following it. The frustrating thing is, I was told in the 60s that we would be on the moon, and we're not on Mars.
Yeah, it's interesting. I did a story of some astronauts once, and they were U.S. astronauts, and they were heartbroken that the U.S. never went back to the moon. But moving on, let's talk a bit about China. And its rockets have been extremely stable. All its launches have gone off to perfection, and its space station up and running in pretty quick time. Tell us your thoughts on that.
Well, some people would say, well, a lot of what China has done, we already did, but the thing is, the Chinese space station up there, Tiangong, has just got its seventh resupply vehicle. They're now talking about adding 2 additional modules. These modules are second decade of the 21st century modules with modern electronics. The International Space Station, I helped design it 30 years ago.
Right.
So there's something to be said about that, but it's an evolution thing. You see the Chinese spacecraft is a variation of the Russian Soyuz, but now China's coming up with their own. So you stand on the shoulders of the giants or the people who came before you, whether they're from your country or from another country. And so what China has done has been very methodical in advancing its goals, not only in Earth orbit for humans, but also on the moon and now on Mars.
Let's talk a bit about, I spoke with a former NASA director, I won't use the name, and was critical that politics in the United States is keeping China and the United States from working together on a space program. Would you like to see these 2 countries work together?
Yeah, I would. And there's been a few cracks, like just recently, they found a way. Our government has imposed a law that says that NASA can't work with China. That's it. But there are ways to sort of get around it, and apparently they found a crack, and now American scientists are able to apply to use some of the, I think it's Chang'e 5 or 6 moon samples, which was not allowed before. So a little bit at a time. But to me, you could go visit the Chinese space station, or China could visit the International Space Station rather easily. It's not the technology, it's the politics. And some people may say, oh, China, this, that, and that. But, in case you haven't noticed, the U.S. and Russia are not getting along on Earth.
And
But we've been up there for 25 years with them. And other than a few small hiccups, we get along well. And we've just extended it another 3 or 4 years. So I personally think that the more you cooperate in space, the thing you learn about in space is how to get along with people.
Right.
Maybe that's the most, that's what we've learned.
Let me ask you about this. I wasn't going to bring it up, but you kind of segued into it. There's a new movie coming out. I'm sure you've heard about this, where Russia and the United States are fighting within the International Space Station to see who's going to control it. Man, what kind of good does that do anybody?
You know what? I haven't seen it yet. I did work on the space station program. I mean, I was involved when the Russians came in. You had all these discussions about things. When you're on that space station, yes, you're from one country or another, and you wear your flag, and you're proud, and you're speaking your native language to the folks back home. But you're part of one crew.
Right.
And you tend to think of your crew first. And so I guess the premise is we go to war and there's the nukes, and each side is told to take the other, and like, they have guns on board. Okay, that's a new one. But I'm suspicious that they would do that, because they now have to think of a way to stay alive up there.
Right.
And fighting each other isn't the way to do it. But it's a movie,
Yeah. Oh, well. Keith, I just had to ask you about that. But I certainly appreciate all your insight. Stay warm, my friend, and as always, thanks very much.